Joining us now, I have former State Department official and international lawyer David Tafuri. David, good to see you again. I'm curious what you're expecting to see from Trump and other world leaders in Davos this week. And does their being together in person move the needle in any way, shape, or form when it comes to Greenland?
Well, he really stirred things up by his Truth Social posts over the last few days. Maybe that was intentional. Maybe he wanted to put this on the agenda and his interest in acquiring Greenland on the agenda at Davos, and he certainly has accomplished that, if that was the goal. I think what the European leaders are hoping is that through dialogue with President Trump and the other key officials, and he's bringing a number of officials from his cabinet, including Marco Rubio, will have meetings with the Europeans, and that they will find a way to diffuse this crisis by assuring the U.S. that it has all of the rights it needs and wants for operation of the U.S. military, for operation of the Navy, and to have rights to the waterways around Greenland, so that the U.S. does not need to acquire Greenland. It's not clear if that's enough for President Trump, though, because he keeps insisting that the U.S. needs to make Greenland part of the United States. The other option is if they can work out some sort of way for the U.S. to acquire Greenland that is legal, that follows international law, follows rule of law. That would require having a referendum in Greenland, and the people in Greenland could become independent under a law from 2009. And if that were to happen, then the U.S. could engage in negotiations directly with the people of Greenland, the government of Greenland, to try to purchase Greenland. That could include a payment to each person living in Greenland. There would also need to be some negotiations with Denmark if that secession does not happen, and Denmark could sell Greenland directly to the United States. But for now, it seems that Denmark does not want to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like everybody in Denmark and Greenland has been vehemently against this. Trump is going to be addressing these countries on the heels of just levying these new tariffs against 8 of these countries that reject his desire to control the island. Is that, speaking of legality, David, is that move going to hold up in court?
Well, we know that the U.S. Supreme Court is going to decide soon whether Trump's tariffs are legal under the IEEPA authority that he used to mount many of the tariffs. And so that decision by the U.S. Supreme Court could impact what he can do in terms of tariffs with respect to the Greenland issue. This U.S. Supreme Court may be concerned by the fact that the President Trump is using tariffs in this new way to coerce allies into selling land that they have as part of their country. And that might actually influence the U.S. Supreme Court, although I expect the U.S. Supreme Court has already made a decision on that case.
Yeah. And let me play some sound for you, because I know EU leaders are warning that they have tools at their disposal and they're prepared to respond to President Trump's new tariffs. But former NATO Supreme Allied Commander General Wesley Clark just told NewsNation that the EU is pretty limited in its options. Take a listen to what he had to say, and I'll get your take on the other side.
Because of Ukraine and the Russian pressure in Ukraine, President Trump has extraordinary leverage over these European leaders. They can't handle Ukraine without the United States, and they know it.
How much leverage does the EU have in this showdown, David?
Well, first of all, General Wesley Clark is a friend. I respect him, and I agree with what he said, that Ukraine complicates things. But I do think Europe has some measures that it can take, especially it could take retaliatory tariffs. I don't think anyone would be surprised by that if the European countries that are impacted by this tariff decided to mount tariffs that are identical going the other way on the same deadlines that President Trump has set. So the end of this month and then June 1st when it goes up to 25%. That could be devastating to the American economy to have 25% tariffs on the sale of American goods into our European allies, which is an important trading partner. And so that does give the European countries leverage. And that could be just the 7 or 8 countries that are impacted by this, or the EU could act collectively.
We'll see what's to come, but man, to be a fly on the wall at these forum discussions this week. David Tafuri, thanks so much for your time and expertise as always.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.